Politicians tend to talk about money in terms of how much the economy is growing. Now, for the public, it's completely the other way around. They don't think, and in fact, they don't actually care about how the economy generally is doing. So a lot of the public increasingly, I think maybe we can dig a little deeper into this, but they do not associate economic growth with improvements to their own personal finances. In fact, there's quite large proportions of the public now that think that economic growth would actually hurt them. If you ask voters, what would be the best way to reduce the cost of living? Voters here now will say money off energy bills. They don't mean policies that might bring about energy bill reductions. They literally mean the government slashing money off energy bills. I can just see the entrenched misery about what people think about their current finances. And my feeling on that is it's going to take more than incremental improvements to convince people that things are really okay.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Mouthy Money podcast. My name is Edmund Greaves. I'm the editor of Mouthy Money. I'm joined as ever by my good co-host, Chris Chu. I'd like to introduce everybody to our guest today. Scarlett Maguire is the founder of a research company called Merlin Strategy. Scarlett, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Morning.
So Scarlett is a bit of a different guest to what we typically have. Often we have guests from financial services sector to unpick specific products, issues, ideas that are going on around money and finance. Scarlett's experience is a little bit different, however. So Scarlett, just tell us a bit about yourself. What's your background and what does Merlin Strategy do?
Yeah, so I set up Merlin Strategy coming up to a year ago, about 9 months ago. We are a research and strategic insights firm, which is, I guess, a slightly fancy way of saying that we do polling, focus groups, stakeholder interviews. And our public presence most commonly focuses on politics, political movements, both here and in the US. But we also do huge amounts of research on other topics as well. We focus quite a lot on the economy and what that means for people and things like the cost of living and other policy areas like tech, AI, energy as well, to work out what people really think and where the gulfs are between public opinion and what some elite policymakers might think.
So that's what we really want to drill in today, and that is that intersection of where we are in the sort of political discussion around money, because it's such an important topic. It's something that affects everybody directly, whether you're in work, retired, whatever it might be. You might be a student or a graduate, anything. Money impacts all of us, and that is so important. And often we see that there is a bit of a mismatch between what gets discussed in the media and in the, I guess, what you would call sort of public discourse, and actually put what people really feel about their money. Now, Scarlett, you obviously, as you say, you do lots in this area. What is your sense of that? Where is that gulf between what goes on in the public discussion of topics around money and how that feeds into politics? And the big question but what are people really thinking on a day-to-day basis about their money?
Yeah, I think it's a distinction of scale and then a distinction of relativity. So in terms of scale, I think when politicians talk about it, and I think we may be seeing this starting to change, but we saw this in America, we're still seeing this in America, and we see this in the UK, that politicians tend to talk about money in terms of how much the economy is growing, whether it was for us, 0.1% or whatever it is that's added to GDP, or how big figures are doing. So they might talk about public debt, they might talk about employment rates, but they don't tend, as often I find, to focus on people's personal finances. Now, for the public, it's completely the other way around. They don't think, and in fact, they don't actually care about how the economy generally is doing. So a lot of the public increasingly, I think maybe we can dig a little deeper into this, but they do not associate economic growth with improvements to their own personal finances, the health of their personal finances. And in fact, there's quite large proportions of the public now that think that economic growth would actually hurt them. I think that's because they've heard politicians talk about it for a long time and they feel left behind by whatever developments have been happening in our economy. They do not think it's been affecting them. So when pollsters ask the question, what's the most important issue you think facing the country? Most commonly, it's the economy and the cost of living that comes top. We've seen immigration jostling up there for the last year or so, but fundamentally it is the economy and the cost of living. But I think what's really important for people to understand is that means the cost of living. And so when people think of that, you go a little bit deeper into the cost of living, they tend to mean their housing costs, so whether that's mortgage or rent, their energy bills, and that's still actually what we find to be with voters. We think people think that the energy crisis has passed in terms of people's energy bills and how they skyrocketed after the invasion of Ukraine, but very prescient in voters' minds still. Food shops, and increasingly actually personal taxation, which is a different interest. But that is what people mean. And so if people are not feeling good about those four things, or if they feel like their wages aren't keeping up with those four things, they're going to feel negatively about the economy generally, no matter what the headline figures are.
So this is really, this is really interesting because the points that you've kind of raised there about what really matters to people, fundamentally that comes down to what is affecting the bottom line in their wallet on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis, isn't it? And this is where the gulf is. Look, cost of living has been in the news for years now. We've passed the worst of it, but we're not really through it. Inflation is still too high for comfort. We've just had some new wage data come through, which, putting the public sector aside, because the public sector is still getting very generous pay rises on paper, the private sector wage figures are not doing better than inflation now. So that cost of living issue is not going away, is it? It's just is it becoming more entrenched? Is there changing over time? Or what do you see in your research?
Yeah, I think it's becoming more entrenched. And this is when we come to another one of those gulfs between understandings and rhetoric when it comes to politicians, because politicians can stand up and rightly say that inflation is coming down. That's not what voters mean when they say they want inflation to come down. They fundamentally mean they want it to be undone, which is obviously much, much harder and not necessarily desirable. Prices are still going up. And again, their prices, particularly in things like their supermarket shop and their energy bills, whilst their wages are failing to keep pace. And, I do a lot of qualitative research as well as quantitative research, and things we hear time and time again is that people will say things like, my bills keep going up, there's nothing left at the end of the month, and now I don't have fun anymore. I don't go out, I don't do the little things I used to do to enjoy myself, I've cut back on, and now it feels like I'm just working to get by. And I think that's actually a hugely important factor when we think about the country's general sort of psyche and how they're feeling about things. It really, really does matter, especially when they're comparing that to how they felt a few years ago. And for most people, they actually see the pandemic as the sort of BCAD moment for that. They feel before the pandemic, maybe things were getting a bit tough, but they were fundamentally fine and their lives were going quite well. After the pandemic, they feel financially anyway, they feel a lot more under the cosh. And then, I think I don't want to sort of get too much into one response here, but this really matters for politicians because it is becoming an increasingly important factor. The story of the last year politically really has been the rise of populist parties on the right and the left. The left can often get ignored there because, Reform has been leading the polls in more than 200 consecutive polls. The Greens certainly haven't, but they've made very substantial gains. And what unites those voters is they're the ones that are most likely to be feeling pessimistic about their cost of living, most likely to feel worried about meeting bills at the end of the most likely to feel down on the country's economic prospects. So, if you're a politician, if you're a Labour politician, if you're a Conservative politician even, this really matters to your voters in a way that I think the force of it, is still underestimated.
So I think what this tells us is some of these effects that have been creating issues for people's wallet for what they feel every day and on a monthly basis. They're long-term trends that have the pandemic is almost like a flashpoint, right? So is there almost just like a change in awareness of and the acceleration of those trends have just made it worse? Because the negativity feels like it's been going for some time, but it's just getting worse now, isn't it?
Yeah, I think this is where qualitative research is really useful because you can probe voters a bit more on how they feel. So they'll say since the pandemic, but actually when you get under it, they think they are very rare that you hear someone say since the financial crisis, I have not felt as well off or I've not felt as comfortable. But they will often say things like the past 20 years. Oh, I think things have been getting worse for the past 20 years. It feels like things haven't been going in the right direction. For the past few governments, and they trace that a bit further back than the Conservative governments, but they don't pinpoint it at the financial crisis. But when you dig under it, that's actually what you said is exactly right. So people have quite a good awareness that things have been slipping for a while, and then again, in their minds, massively accelerated under the pandemic. Now, I think again, it's interesting if we look back on that because to start with, people wouldn't have felt it, or a lot of people didn't feel it with the pandemic. Things like the furlough scheme. They weren't going out, they weren't spending money, they potentially had a bit more savings. It was obviously the shocks that came after or as a consequence of some of those policies.
Yeah. Chris, with your own finances, let's take a personal look here. I know you've got, because this is the thing is we talk about some of these big picture things. We talk about fiscal drag, we talk about GDP, we talk about some of this stuff, and maybe we're victims of sitting on the wrong side of it as well. So, but Chris, do you feel like these things should matter and that people need to start paying attention?
Yes, fundamentally. I do understand the point that Scarlett's making, and that is borne out in conversations that I have with my friends, which is, why does this impact me? I think there's, going back to the sort of broader point there about things have been getting gradually worse over the last 20 years. I think if you look at the sort of broad trend data, that's pretty difficult to deny in terms of economic growth. It's all been a bit flat. We had a major shock with 08, 09, with the global financial crisis, the banking crisis, credit crisis, whatever you want to call it. Then we sort of bumped along for a little while, and COVID came along, whacked us all back into our houses. Economic growth contracted hugely. And then there is some point where there's going to be a reckoning around that, I think, when we come out of it. Add to that other shocks like AI, Ukraine war, global instability, or that kind of thing, then if you're looking at a sort of a bigger picture here, then it's bound in a interdependent, globalized world that we're going to be impacted by all of those things. And there's going to be a sort of downturn that we're going to have to kind of live with. Instinctively, or not instinctively, actually, intuitively, I probably understood that to a great degree. My own personal situation was, actually, my career started quite well during the global financial crisis, Ed. So I had a good few years where the firm I was working for kind of was able to kind of roll with the punches of that and take some opportunities. And so, I did quite well. It's only really actually since the pandemic where I have started to feel a real pinch. My own personal situation's changed. I had 2 kids and took on a lot more costs that way. So there's a mix of kind of the personal and the macro and the micro there, if you like. But yeah, this last 12 months, I absolutely have felt some of the things that Scarlett mentioned there about people not feeling like they can go out, not feeling like they can enjoy themselves to the same degree. And it has had a meaningful impact on my psyche and my thoughts around government and all the rest of it. And it does ring a little bit hollow. I think a lot of the rise of this populist stuff, without getting too political, does have an economic bent in it, with regards to everybody is starting to feel like they're not getting a fair deal that they were promised from the system, right? So, I have done everything that I was supposed to do, and I've done relatively well compared to others. So I'm not sat here complaining to you, but even I am starting to feel like, well, actually, this isn't what we were told would happen. If you get your head down and work hard, you can achieve, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And every time we turn around, we seem to be stepping on some kind of collective rake, which massively impacts my ability to go on and achieve the things that I want to achieve. And I've meaningfully downgraded my ambitions when it comes to sort of what I want to do around my house, what I want to do in terms of travel, what I want to do in terms of lifestyle generally. I've cut back on a lot of sort of social activity and refocused on things that are a lot cheaper. So that is going to impact me. That is going to leave me feeling slightly resentful. And if you extrapolate that out across the sort of economic continuum, if you like, people are going to be annoyed. And so that's going to play out in what Scarlett's probably seeing in her responses and what we're going to see at the polls in the near future. I also have become increasingly pessimistic. Advent of AI means there's going to be huge disruption coming in sort of the white collar sector, which is where I operate. And so we're going to see further disparities, further shocks, and economic shocks invariably lead to social upheavals of one way, shape or another. So without getting too apocalyptic about it, Ed, I know you don't like it when I do that. I am concerned. I am concerned because 20 years, no political party of any stripe has been able to find a route out of this sort of economic muddle that we found ourselves in. And a lot of people seem to be pinning their hopes on AI, which from what I can see is run by a few tech billionaires who are looking to feather their own nest and don't really care whether or not you and I are able to go on holiday or have a more comfortable life, Ed. So yeah, there's going to be some reshaping going on, I think, and we're in the midst of that, which is interesting. Does mean that we should pay attention to economic trends because they're going to massively impact what happens to us economically and politically and what's going to happen to my wallet. But I can understand if people switch off and go, do you know what? I'm just going to hurt these people at the polls and try and struggle on.
There is that. There's this concept of, and it used to be quite common, I think, to talk about it. I think in the post-financial crisis when unemployment was an issue, but inflation was not really so much an issue. So concept is sort of an economic thing called the misery index. So you take the misery index is when you add the unemployment rate to the inflation rate. And obviously if inflation is high and unemployment is high, you get a kind of a measure there of how miserable everyone is. So there is a way of quantifying it. And I think there's been kind of rising discussion to this sort of misery index idea. Again, it's probably one of those things that we like to talk about, but it's just not cutting through. It's not going to cut through. People are going to think, oh, well, the misery index is up to X, Y, Z. Scarlett, I want to go back to a point you made a little earlier, which I thought was really interesting. You mentioned, obviously, you do work in the US as well. And you said that in the US, maybe awareness of these sorts of themes and issues is perhaps a bit better. Is that right? And Is there anything we can do in the UK to resolve that? Like, can we learn from the Americans here?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, they tend to have more investment, so they tend to be a little bit more invested in how, or like directly invested in how the overall economy is doing, or associate it directly. We would, I think, do a lot to get how America's doing in terms of their economy. But voters say, well, no, I don't care. My bills are still high. I still don't feel like I can do the things I thought I was going to be able to do. They tend to call it affordability rather than cost of living. Are still deeply underwater. There are some slight differences, but actually fundamentally still just care about their own personal finances. And I do wonder whether there is, I think in the US that there is a slightly better understanding of this, but in the UK, I do slightly worry because now, as a consequence of all of this, and I think as a consequence of some of the policies during COVID, if you ask voters what would be the best way to reduce the cost of living, voters here now will say money off energy bills. So they don't mean policies that might bring about energy bill reductions. They literally mean the government slashing money off energy bills, as we'd seen various governments do in the last few years. And growing the economy comes right down the list. Is much further down the list. Things like reducing price of groceries, again, score much higher. So sort of direct government intervention to slash money off people's bills. And I think this is where you get a problem, actually, because I think, again, I still think about the economy a lot in terms of how I'm doing and my own personal finances and what worries, concerns I might have, what lifestyle choices I feel I am or I'm not able to make. But I can acknowledge a connection between sort of various policies and then the trickle down effect for what that might mean for the economy generally. And voters increasingly are pulling those things apart. And so I think it does mean that if you were to have a politician that wanted to do things that might help get the economy on track, running again, it would be a very hard sell, especially if it came with any trade-offs, because voters actually just want money off now.
This is really, really interesting, this point around energy bills, because actually once you start getting into kind of deep policy wonk territory and economists who spend a lot of time looking at the UK's economy and why it's performed so poorly in the past, realistically, nearly 20 years now, because the financial crisis started kicking off in 2007. That is nearly 20 years ago now. And actually, the voices are quiet, but they are growing, I would say, that actually one of the most fundamental problems with the UK economy is our cost of energy is too high, right? So businesses find it too expensive to provide products affordably. Households spend too much of their money on energy, unable to run things cheaply. There's too expensive to run your car, all these kind of things. And actually the economic effect of high energy prices, it hampers productivity, it hampers general GDP growth. And that feeds into people's wallets. So here's the interesting thing. Are the British public actually right to focus on energy as the big problem? They're actually, whether or not it's intuitive or they have this sort of unbelievable, actual, real understanding of the problem, they've potentially landed on the solution, right? If we cut energy bills, it will make things better. And that's very interesting. I mean, I find that very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. And I think you're right. They are in a position where I think they're right to say that it is energy bills. And we have some of the, highest costs of energy in the Western developed world. And I always had it. I used to work a lot in America. I still go over quite a lot, but I used to do a lot of work in America. And I remember being shocked because it was DC in January, which was freezing cold outside. And I was sitting in someone's house and the house was really warm. And I said, how much do you have your heating on? And they said, all day. And I was like, what? And I was like, how much does that cost you? It's a fraction of the cost it takes me to heat my house for 2 or 3 hours a day. And I think it is astonishing, but I think this is the thing with the energy bills. You're right, it stops people doing a lot. It's behind a lot of the increases in prices we see elsewhere because of the commercial energy costs. But on a personal level, it also makes people feel poor. People got used to not having to choose between being freezing. I know there's the whole thing, or you can just put a jumper on. But fundamentally, if you're having to really choose between, how much you spend on a grocery shop or whether you sit in your house very cold on some days of the year, that makes people feel very poor. And it's a sort of standard of life I don't think they expected to live. I think it's part of the reason why things like the winter fuel cut payment, which is still the most noticed thing this Labour government has done, it's the most unpopular and the most noticed thing, resonated so strongly because a lot of the public, and it wasn't just pensioners, even though it affected pensioners, are furious about the fact that they feel now they have to sit in their houses freezing cold for a large part of the year.
I think on that, sorry, just to add, there's something Victorian about that. That literally occurred to me yesterday. My house was freezing and you know what I actually thought of? I thought of Ebenezer Scrooge in his full pajama get up and thinking, no wonder he wore a hat and all that other stuff because, he wouldn't heat his own home. But anyway, that's a little bit too far. The other thing I would say is Ofgem, you know, Ofgem seemingly saying, "Oh no, we're basically useless. We work counter to what the public is expecting in terms of putting caps on energy prices." I think that's had a major impact on how people see this, and they're like, "Well, this doesn't work for me. This entire system works for the people who are making the profits out of me, and as far as I can tell, this organisation is largely useless for what I need, and therefore I'm becoming even more annoyed by that and even more disassociated from that, and want starker, more extreme responses to that, which might come in the shape of government directly intervening to reduce my energy bills. It's about time they started working for me than for these sort of globalized companies who are taking money out of my pocket every month. And as you rightly point out, Scarlett, I'm only able to blast my heater for 3 hours before I've got to put a hoodie on and get under a blanket. Yeah, there is I completely identify what you're saying there, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's, like my Christmas present this year was an electric blanket, which again is just something that 5, 6, 7 years ago I would never have been as thrilled as I was. It was a very nice electric blanket, but you do think this is ridiculous. And you're absolutely right as well to talk about the anger directed at the energy companies. Anger at energy and utility companies, things like water companies are absolutely through the roof. I mean, you can. I don't think again. I mean, in some ways, it's missed opportunities to politicians because no one's really capitalising on it. But the anger directed at them, and voters are also now in a state where, I mean, nationalising of these sorts of things has always been actually more popular than people might think. There is a huge desire to see much stronger government action on energy and utility companies, and this will be why.
This is where I'm going to start an argument with Chris now, because I have completely the opposite views of what should be happening in the energy industry. I think the thing that frustrates me about energy, as a financial journalist, having covered the sector in the past, and we don't really cover it anymore because it's kind of not central, but maybe, it should be more of part of our discussion. But before the pandemic, we had not that on the energy production side of things, that's a hot mess of its own making with regulations and stuff. But we did have lots of energy companies that were competing. And actually what I think killed the energy market was the price cap, because as soon as they implemented a price cap, the companies all just put their tariffs right up next to it, and there was no competitiveness anymore. Then we saw a series of businesses go bust because they couldn't compete against the big brands, and it just created more mess. And I think we need to get rid of the price cap. People need to, and I actually we start getting into slightly dangerous territory here. We had things like energy price guarantee during the pandemic, all of that kind of stuff. I think it just embedded some of the problems that we now have. Anyway, there's perhaps a bit of a rabbit hole.
Listeners, please post your comments below about Ed's idea to increase your energy bills. I'm sure they'll
look, if we can have a national energy company, that would be fine. But then I also want the government to get rid of all of the regulations that stop us from building cheap energy production. That's what needs to happen. You can't have it where it's too expensive to build a nuclear power plant, too expensive to build solar, too expensive to all of this kind of stuff. And then
it feels too expensive to do anything, Ed. That's the problem. It's just like they're hamstrung. They can't build the houses. They can't do any of the things that we need to do. We talk about this deficit all the time. It's like, okay, well, what do we do? Sorry, but carry on with your point. I do apologize.
It's fine. I think for me, the answer is that you need to start stripping away all the things that make it expensive, and you have to understand better what those things are. And I know Scarlett, you mentioned there, I think that was a really interesting point that I kind of now just tease out in the final section of this chat about Americans being more invested in the US economy. And it's something that we come back to time and again, because obviously we're kind of real proponents here of everybody should be investing. It's an important long-term activity that we should be engaged with more. So that's a really interesting point. And we know that British people don't invest enough. So what are some of those attitudes to investing, and what do you think we could do to because the government has a stated aim that it wants more people to invest, right? How do we do that? How do we encourage people to engage with the process?
I think there's lots of different things, and some of it in a way feels a little bit too big to even tackle, but there's a couple of things going on in the current economic environment makes it much more challenging. So when people have less money, they're actually less willing to put whatever they do have aside because they feel like they need it now. And you can see this even with people's attitudes towards saying, well, I'm not going to pay as much into my pension, or I've even stopped making additional contributions to my pension, or whatever it is, because they're saying I just need the cash right here, right now, so I'm not putting anything away. So that's one part of it. It's very difficult to do when people feel like they've got a shortage of cash. And then the other part is that it's still fundamentally seen to be a risk. Yeah, and that's very, very difficult to get away from. People think that, okay, fine, it can go up, but they tend to focus on the fact that it might go down, and they're not prepared to part with their cash for something that they don't think is just going to sit there. So we have a much more, I think, safety first and even sort of like slight emergency mindset, which is being like, we don't want to give anything away because it might disappear. And I think that's a very difficult thing to overcome. You're absolutely right in that the government is trying to encourage people to invest, but I think it's going to take quite a lot more to get to that position where people are feeling confidence and sort of trusted enough to do it.
I think there's a wider point here, Ed. For the last 20 years we talked about, we've had one issue after another. We've stepped on various rakes, or rakes have been thrust in our faces. And there's also a disenfranchisement that people feel around sort of this situation. It's out of our control. I think a lot of that is to do with the way that the media has covered these issues, the way that social media interacts and kind of makes people feel like stuff's happening to them rather than they can impact the world around them. And then there's an education piece, and we can sit here and talk about the education piece until the cows come home. But I do think there's a broader point here about if people start to feel like they're spectators in their own financial futures and financial fates, then and I'm one of these people probably where my emergency fund is probably too high. I've said it before on this pod, but with the uncertainty out there, the economic uncertainty, with job markets uncertainty, with AI, with higher interest rates, although those are coming down. I do invest, but I could probably invest more. And I'm probably a good case for the government as somebody who's taken that on board and decided to try and take some risk. But even I have this kind of like, but something could go wrong tomorrow, because let's be honest, the evidence of the last 20 years means that every couple of years we're going to walk into something. So I want to be prepared for it, but I'm probably doing myself a disservice in the future.
I mean, the fun education, I understand it, and there's big campaigns in the media about young people, for children to understand, and it's very difficult to legislate through a cultural sense of something. The thing that concerns me is that, okay, well, we might we might use this education to create a new generation of investors, but what about the rest of us? We're all supposed to be engaged in this, and if we don't engage with this, it's going to lead to worse outcomes. I think, firstly, I think the regulator has a lot to answer for. That safety first approach is harmful, I think, because you just couch everything in negative language. It's not good. And I also think pension providers need to start being more overt by reminding, because so many of us are in workplace pensions now. The vast majority of us in the private sector are supposed to be in a defined contribution pension. So you should see that come out of your paycheck, go to your pension provider through your workplace. That goes into, and we don't communicate well enough that your pension is an investment. You are investing your pension. It's not just sitting in an account somewhere or contributing to a wider fund, although that may change in the near future. It's overcoming that. No, you are already an investor, so you need to be engaged with this because it's already happening, kind of thing. I get pessimistic about it because I think it's difficult to overcome. But I think for those people who understand it enough to engage and make sure they are doing something, there's a real opportunity to improve their own personal outcomes. So I think it's important. Yeah, go on.
Despite all of this economic uncertainty we've talked about, and I know we've had people on here cautioning against pointing towards market highs, as markets are designed to hit highs, is kind of, I think Chris Linger said to us previously from Stratified, but things are growing in my SIP, things are growing in my ISA, things are growing in my children's junior ISAs faster than they would if they were held in cash. I'm aware of that. So there's definitely a benefit to it. There's also downside. You logged on to all those various accounts during the pandemic and had a look. I had a minor wobble and had to have a lie down for half an hour and thought that my finances were decimated forever, as it was a complete bloodbath. So you do have to, it's not for the faint-hearted, but the evidence suggests, and past performance is no indication of future, as we know, but the evidence suggests that it's probably wise to have some exposure to markets. And the Americans, as we pointed out, are far more comfortable with doing that and seem to be gleaning the benefits of it. And also it makes you more engaged with your surroundings, it makes you more engaged with the economic context, and makes you more aware of what's happening. And that can only be a good thing when it comes to making decisions or putting pressure on policy stuff that's going to actually meaningfully change your life. So yeah, it's definitely helped to make me more engaged in my finance, but more engaged with the wider economy and more engaged politically as well, which I think we could do with more of.
Scarlett, I'm going to end now with just probably asking the trickiest question of all. I may ask you to get your crystal ball out now. Do you think moving forward, I mean, we've still got several years of the same government notionally left. They have policies in place. What is your sense of where things are going? Is it just more of the cost of living as an issue? Are we going to see anything new rising? What's your kind of feeling around that? And what does data tell you?
So I sort of have what my data tells me and then have what some of my clients tell me. Because I work with some hedge funds and financial institutions, and quite a lot of them were actually quite bullish in a way about the UK economy and say it's about to turn a corner, things are going to be great. We could have 2-3% growth, and then people will start feeling a lot better, and that might feed into better political stability. So I'm torn because I've got people saying that to me on the one hand, and then on the other, I can just see the entrenched misery about what people think about their current finances. And my feeling on that is it's going to take more than incremental improvements to convince people that things are really okay. And this is not, because we saw this a little bit with the budget when the government were trying to say, oh, the energy bills are going to be, you have money off the energy bills, and people say, well, it's a drop in the ocean, it doesn't make any difference, because I've got so many other outgoings. And so if you see people starting to feel their their pay increases slightly outstripping the cost of living, my instinct is there's still going to be quite a lot of residual anger about it. And that might take quite a lot to transform, especially when they think, they feel angry about the state of public services and things like that as well. And I think there's another dimension here as well, which is that young people often get ignored in these conversations. Young people are having an incredibly tough time of it. We now have seen our youth unemployment top Europe, which is astonishing. And I've been doing quite a lot of work into how young men and young women feel, and it's alarming. And it's actually especially alarming with young women. You feel pretty pessimistic about everything. And this matters not just because of how young people feel. They feel they'll never get a stake in society. This can also lead to quite extreme political views and feeling very disenfranchised. But it doesn't just matter about what the young people feel, because actually a lot of these young people are increasingly living with their parents. And I was doing a focus group even just earlier this week with a series of voters as to how are you feeling about the cost of living. And one woman said, I'm really fortunate. I've got a really good pension. I was very lucky. I've paid off my mortgage. And actually, I feel quite insulated from some of the problems that I hear. And they said, but my 3 children in their 20s are all living at home, and I despair because I cannot see a good future for them. And so when you have those sorts of things persisting, I find it unlikely that we're going to see the public change their mind about this stuff in the short term or medium term future.
Perhaps a pessimistic note on which to end. I know, sorry, Scarlett, if we led you down that path, but let's take the positivity of what the hedge funds have to say. Things might actually be getting better. There are knotty issues, and hopefully we can fix them. I don't know if it'll be enough to save the current government. It reminds me of the major government in the 90s where they fixed the economy and the public decided to get rid of them anyway, and then New Labour rode that kind of positive economic wave for about a decade nearly. So yeah, lots to think about there. Thank you, Scarlett. That's been really, really interesting. Chris, thank you as ever as well.
My pleasure.
And Scarlett, if people want to find a bit more about Merlin Strategy, where should they go? What's the best place to look for it?
There's a website, merlinstrategy.com. There's also my LinkedIn, Scarlett Maguire. Should be quite easy to track down.
Lovely, brilliant. Well, I think that brings us to an end. So thank you both for this animated and interesting discussion. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Do share your views. What concerns you most about your wallet? What do you think the government should be doing? We want to hear all your opinions on it. So do let us know. With that, I shall say thank you and goodbye. Thank you, everybody, and goodbye.